He found her in the dirt, a woman who didn't belong there, huddled against the wall of the general store, looking like a porcelain doll someone had thrown away. The folks in Cedar Ridge just walked around her like she was a stray dog or a bad memory. But Samuel Hartwell stopped. He was the wealthiest man for 100 miles in any direction. He owned the land, the cattle, the town itself in most ways that mattered. He had everything a man could want, except a future. His wife, Sarah, was 7 years in the grave. His son, born on the same night she died, had drawn only 3 breaths. At 52, time was a thief, and it had stolen everything from him but his money. He looked down at the woman, at the fine bones in her face, the intelligence in her exhausted winter sky eyes. He saw the ghost of good breeding in the way she held herself, even in the dust. And an idea, sharp and sudden and utterly insane, took root in his mind. He knelt, his expensive boots settling in the same filth her worn-out dress was lying in. "Ma'am," he said, his voice the low rumble of a man used to giving orders, "I'm Samuel Hartwell." She tried to push herself up, a flicker of pride refusing to be extinguished. "I don't require charity, sir." Her voice was educated, crisp, out of place. Samuel almost smiled. "I'm not offering charity," he said. "I'm offering a deal." He saw the flicker of hope she tried to hide. It was all he needed. "I need an heir," he stated, the words as blunt and hard as granite. "You need a home. Perhaps we can help each other." The words hung in the air between them, a proposal so cold, so practical, it was almost cruel. A business transaction for a human life, for a legacy. She stared at him, her eyes searching his face for madness, for mockery, for some sign that this was all a cruel joke. She found none. And in that moment, two broken souls, drowning in their own separate loneliness, reached for the same lifeline. But they had no idea the lifeline was tied to an anchor, and the storm was just beginning. What do you think she should do? Let me know in the comments below. And if you think this story's already taken a turn, you better hit that subscribe button because you have no idea what's coming next. Samuel led her to the town's only hotel restaurant. The walk was a parade of whispers and stares. He could feel the judgment of the townspeople like a physical weight. The lonely, grieving rancher finally cracked, talking to a vagrant in the street. He didn't care. He ordered her a full breakfast without asking what she wanted. Eggs, bacon, biscuits, coffee. He watched as she forced herself to eat slowly, to maintain the dignity that was clearly all she had left. "My name is Martha Collins," she said, her voice stronger now that she had food in her belly. "I was a school teacher in Kansas," she told him, her story unfolding in quiet, measured tones. A husband, a banker's son, an infant daughter, both taken by cholera in the same week. She had nothing left, so she'd started west, chasing a rumor of teaching positions. The money ran out, then the hope. Samuel listened, but he was calculating. Educated, widowed, a mother who'd lost a child. She understood the specific kind of hell he lived in every single day. She was perfect. "The deal is a marriage," he said, cutting right to the heart of it. "Legal, binding, respectable. You will be Mrs. Hartwell. You will have a home, security my name. You will want for nothing." Martha's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "And in return?" "A child," Samuel said. "A son, if God is willing. An heir to carry on the Hartwell name." She stared at him, her pale eyes unblinking. "You're proposing to breed me like one of your cattle." The words were sharp, meant to wound, but Samuel didn't flinch. "I'm proposing a solution that benefits us both, Mrs. Collins. I'm an honest man. I won't lie and call it romance." He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "The more personal aspects of the marriage would be for the sole purpose of conception. I will not force myself on you, but I do expect you to hold up your end of the bargain." The brutality of it was breathtaking, a contract written in desperation and grief. "And if I can't?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "If I prove barren? Then you will still be my wife. You will still have a home." "So, he said. "I'm not a monster, Mrs. Collins. I'm just a man running out of time." She looked down at her plate, then back at him. He could see the gears turning in her mind, the weighing of options. The gutter on one side, this cold, loveless arrangement on the other. For a woman who had lost everything, it wasn't much of a choice. I have conditions, she said, and Samuel felt a spark of admiration. She was beaten, but not broken. I'm listening. A period of adjustment, 6 months, before, before we attempt to fulfill that part of the contract. Reasonable, he agreed, and I want it understood that this is my choice. I am not being coerced. We are partners in this. Equal partners. The sheer audacity of it. A woman in her position demanding equality. It was the moment he knew he'd been right about her. Agreed, he said, extending a hand across the table. Do we have a deal, Mrs. Collins? She placed her small, dirt-stained hand in his large, calloused one. The touch was like lightning, a jolt of something unexpected, something that felt dangerously unlike business. We do, Mr. Hartwell. Samuel, he corrected. My wife should call me Samuel. As they walked out of the hotel, the deal sealed, Martha had no way of knowing she wasn't just stepping into a new life. She was stepping into a house of ghosts, a town of secrets, and a legacy of pain that was about to rise from the grave. And it was already too late to turn back. The Hartwell Ranch house was a fortress of prosperity, a two-story declaration of success against the harsh prairie. But as Martha stepped across the threshold, a chill snaked down her spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The house was perfect. Too perfect. It was clean, orderly, and suffocatingly silent. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum dedicated to a dead woman. Maria, this is Mrs. Collins, Samuel said to the housekeeper who appeared as if from nowhere. She'll be staying in the guest room. Tomorrow she will be Mrs. Hartwell. The housekeeper, a weathered woman named Maria, nodded, her dark eyes taking in every detail of Martha's worn dress and tired face. Her expression was unreadable, a carefully guarded neutrality that spoke of long years of service and secrets kept. Samuel led Martha upstairs to the guest room. It was beautiful. A four-poster bed, a view of the garden, a copper bathtub already waiting with towels and soap. It was more luxury than Martha had seen in years. And then she saw it. On the bedside table, in a heavy silver frame, was a photograph of a smiling young woman. Her eyes were gentle, her face full of a light that Martha felt she had lost long ago. Sarah. She was beautiful, Martha said softly. Samuel's face, which had been carefully neutral, closed up like a fist. She was everything good in this world, he said, his voice rough. He picked up the photograph, his thumb stroking the glass. She wanted children more than anything. She would have been a wonderful mother. The pain in his voice was a raw, living thing. It filled the room, pressing down on Martha. This wasn't just a house haunted by a memory. It was a house held captive by one. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. I am not asking you to be Sarah, he said, his voice strained. I am asking you to give me what she could not. The words were a slap in the face, a cold reminder of the contract. She was not a wife. She was a vessel, a replacement womb. After he left, Martha sank onto the bed, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. She had escaped the street, but she had walked into a gilded cage, one where she would always be compared to the ghost of a perfect wife. Later, as she soaked in the hot bath, trying to wash away the grime of the road and the chill of Samuel's words, Maria entered the room without knocking. She held a small wooden box. Senor Samuel, he asked me to give you this, she said, her tone flat. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a simple gold wedding band. It was his mother's, Maria explained. He said Sarah's ring would not fit. Another comparison, another ghost. Martha slipped the ring on her finger. It was a perfect fit. The weight of it felt less like a promise and more like a shackle. Maria, Martha asked, her voice barely a whisper, what do you think of this? The old housekeeper looked at Martha, and for the first time a flicker of emotion crossed her face. It was not kindness. It was pity. I think, Maria said slowly, that this house has been dead for 7 years. Senor Samuel, he thinks a baby will bring it back to life. Her eyes met Martha's in the mirror. But some things, once they are dead, should stay buried. The woman's words were a warning, A dark premonition that sent a fresh wave of fear through Martha. She was in the heart of Samuel's kingdom now, but she was utterly alone. A stranger in a dead woman's house, bound by a devil's bargain, with a ghost for a rival and a secret that was festering in the very walls around her. And the wedding hadn't even happened yet. The wedding was a 10-minute affair in a makeshift courtroom above the saloon. Judge Morrison, a man who looked like he'd seen every kind of frontier desperation, didn't bat an eye. Maria and Dr. Patterson served as witnesses, their faces grim. Samuel's kiss was a brief, dry press of lips against hers. It sealed the contract. She was Martha Hartwell now. She belonged to him. The wedding lunch at the general store was her first test. The town was there, vultures circling, hungry for gossip. And the queen vulture was a woman named Elizabeth Thornton, the banker's wife. "Samuel, dear," she cooed, her smile as sharp as broken glass. "You must introduce me to your bride." The pause was deliberate, insulting. "Elizabeth, this is my wife, Martha," Samuel said, his jaw tight. Elizabeth's eyes raked over Martha, cataloging the mended dress, the thin frame. "How delightful. Tell me, dear, where did you two meet? It all happened so suddenly." The entire room went silent, waiting. This was the moment that would define her. "Samuel found me when I was in need," Martha said, her voice clear and steady. "He offered his help, and I discovered a kindness in him that I have not known for a very long time." It was the truth, but not the whole truth. A masterfully crafted answer that gave them nothing. Elizabeth's smile tightened. She had been denied her pound of flesh. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "Samuel's dear Sarah was such a treasure. So accomplished. She set a very high standard. You have very large shoes to fill." The attack was direct, a poisoned dart aimed at Martha's biggest insecurity. "I would never presume to try and fill Mrs. Hartwell's shoes," Martha replied, her chin held high. "I only hope to honor her memory by bringing happiness back into her husband's life." A murmur of approval went through the room. Round one to the newcomer. Samuel's hand found hers under the table, a silent message of support. But the victory was short-lived. As they settled into life at the ranch, Martha realized the true extent of Sarah's ghost. It wasn't just in the photograph. It was everywhere. Her clothes still hung in the master bedroom closet, neatly pressed, smelling faintly of lavender. Her books sat on the shelves, a ribbon marking a page she'd never finish. Her sheet music was still on the piano. Samuel never spoke of it. He slept in the master bedroom, while Martha remained in the guest room. They were husband and wife in name only, two ships passing in the silent, grief-choked hallways of the house. Martha knew she had to do something. She couldn't live like this, a curator in the museum of her husband's first marriage. She had to carve out a place for herself, or she would be swallowed whole by the ghost of Sarah Hartwell. Her chance came from an unexpected place. She found Samuel's accounting ledgers. They were a mess. He was a brilliant rancher, but a terrible bookkeeper. He was being overcharged by suppliers, paying for things twice. She took the books to him. "You're losing money," she said simply, pointing out the errors. He looked at the neat columns she had drawn, at the corrections she had made. He saw not just the saved money, but the intelligence, the capability. For the first time, he was looking at her, Martha, not as a contract or a vessel, but as a partner. "Sarah used to handle the books," he said quietly. Martha's heart sank. Even here in a column of numbers, the ghost was present. "Then perhaps," she said, her voice sharper than she intended, "it's time you had a wife who can do it just as well." The challenge hung in the air. It was a risk. She could have alienated him, driven him further into his shell. Instead, a slow smile spread across Samuel's face. It was the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him. It transformed his stern, grief-worn features. "Perhaps it is," he said, sliding the ledger across the table to her. "The job is yours, Mrs. Hartwell." It was a small victory, a tiny foothold in this house of memories. But Martha knew the war was far from over. Because as she took control of the household, she started to uncover things. Discrepancies, small amounts of money unaccounted for, week after week, for years. Money that stopped disappearing around the same time Sarah died. and a new, terrifying question began to form in her mind. What if Samuel's grief wasn't just grief? What if it was guilt? Martha's next move was the ranch hands, a dozen rough men, loyal to Samuel, but fiercely devoted to the memory of Sarah. They looked at Martha with suspicion. She was the outsider, the usurper. She heard them talking. They didn't think she'd last. She needed to win them over. She needed to prove she was more than just the rancher's strange new bride. She found her weapon in the small carpet bag that held the last remnants of her old life, a teaching slate and a piece of chalk. I hear some of you never had much schooling, she announced one evening as the men gathered for supper in the cookhouse. I was a teacher. I'd be willing to hold classes, reading, writing, arithmetic, for anyone who's interested. The men shifted, looking at each other. Some of them laughed. The idea was absurd. Then Tom Fletcher, the foreman, a man as weathered as the landscape itself, spoke up. The boss says you're to be respected, ma'am. But Sarah, Mrs. Hartwell used to read to us sometimes. From the Bible. We don't need no schoolin'. It was another wall, another comparison to the sainted Sarah. Mrs. Hartwell read to you, Martha said, her voice even. I am offering to teach you to read for yourselves, so you can read your own mail, so you can understand your own contracts, so no man can ever cheat you because you can't read the words on a page. Silence. She had hit a nerve. She had offered them not charity but power. Young Billy Santos, a kid no older than 19, was the first to speak. I'd like that, ma'am. One by one, others followed. Even old Pete Morrison, a grizzled cowhand who looked like he'd been born on a horse, grunted his assent. The lessons began in the barn. It was slow, frustrating work. These were men whose hands were made for ropes and reins, not chalk. But Martha was patient. She was a good teacher. She saw the flicker of understanding in their eyes, the pride on their faces when they wrote their own names for the first time. And she saw something else. Samuel started watching the lessons. He'd stand in the shadows of the barn doorway, just observing. She could feel his eyes on her, and his expression was something she couldn't quite read. It was more than just approval. It was something else, something warmer. The ice around his heart was beginning to thaw. One evening after a lesson, he walked her back to the house. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. You have a gift, he said quietly. The men respect you. It's not something they give easily. They wanted to learn, she said, shrugging it off. It's more than that, he insisted. You see them as men, not just workers. Sarah, she was kind to them, but she was always the lady of the ranch. You treat them like equals. The comparison, for once, was in her favor. It was a small crack in the pedestal he'd built for his first wife. They reached the porch, and for a moment they just stood there, the comfortable silence of the evening settling around them. The distance that had defined their relationship seemed to shrink. He was standing closer than usual, close enough that she could smell the scent of leather and dust and clean soap that clung to him. She felt a pull toward him, a strange, unexpected longing. This wasn't part of the contract. This wasn't in the deal. This was dangerous. He must have felt it too. He took a half step back, the wall sliding back into place. Good night, Martha, he said, his voice suddenly formal again. Good night, Samuel. As she lay in her bed in the guest room, she stared at the ceiling, her heart pounding. She was starting to feel something for this broken, grieving man, something that felt terrifyingly like hope. But then her mind went back to the ledgers, to the missing money, and she remembered the look in Maria's eyes. Some things, once they are dead, should stay buried. The house was quiet, but Martha was starting to realize it was screaming secrets, and she was afraid that if she pulled on one loose thread, the whole carefully constructed facade of Samuel Hartwell's life would come unraveling, and she would be buried in the ruins. The thaw continued, slow and tentative, like the first green shoots of spring pushing through frozen ground. Samuel started talking, not just about the ranch but about his past, about his father, a hard man who had carved this empire out of nothing, about his mother, the woman whose ring Martha now wore, and finally about Sarah. He didn't speak of her as a saint anymore. He spoke of her as a woman. He told Martha about her laughter, about her stubborn streak, about her terrible singing voice. He was letting Martha see the real person, not just the perfect memory. He brought out a portfolio of Sarah's sketches. She had been a talented artist. She'd drawn the wildflowers, the ranch hands, the sweeping landscapes. The last sketch was of Samuel. It captured him perfectly. The strength in his jaw, the sadness in his eyes, but also a hint of the humor Martha was just beginning to discover. "She saw you clearly," Martha said softly. "She saw the best in everyone," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at Martha, his gaze intense. "Just like you do." The moment was electric. The air crackled with unspoken words, with feelings that had no place in their contract. That night, a winter storm blew in, trapping them in the house. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the windows. The isolation was absolute. It was just the two of them, surrounded by the storm and the ghosts. They sat by the fire, the silence stretching between them, no longer awkward, but filled with a heavy, waiting tension. "I lied to you," Samuel said suddenly, his voice so low Martha almost didn't hear him over the wind. She looked at him, her heart starting to beat a little faster. "About what?" "Sarah's death." He wouldn't meet her eyes. He just stared into the flames. It wasn't just the birth. It wasn't just the limits of frontier medicine. Martha held her breath. This was it. The secret. She was fragile, he said, struggling for the words. After 3 years of trying for a child, the pregnancy was hard on her. She grew distant, melancholy. Dr. Patterson called it a woman's ailment. He said it would pass. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a pain so deep it was bottomless. The night she went into labor, we argued. A terrible argument. About my brother, Jake. Jake, the younger brother who had vanished years ago, presumed dead. He was always in trouble. Gambling. Debts. He'd written to Sarah asking for money. Money I refused to give him. She thought I was being too hard on him. I told her she was being naive. I said some terrible things. He choked on the words, the memory still raw after 7 years. I stormed out. I went to the barn to cool off. When I came back, the labor had started hard and fast. Everything went wrong. The baby, he was barely alive. And Sarah, she was bleeding. Dr. Patterson couldn't stop it. She just faded away. He buried his face in his hands. My last words to her were angry ones. I left her alone when she needed me. Maybe if I'd stayed, if we hadn't argued, she would have had the strength to fight. Maybe I could have done something. The guilt he carried wasn't over some dark, murderous secret. It was the common, terrible guilt of the survivor, the endless, torturous loop of what if. Martha moved from her chair and knelt in front of him. She took his hands, pulling them away from his face. His cheeks were wet with tears. It wasn't your fault, Samuel, she said, her voice firm but gentle. It was a tragedy. You can't carry that burden. How can I not? He whispered. I failed her. You have honored her, Martha countered. You have kept her memory alive. But Samuel, you can't let that memory keep you from living. She wouldn't have wanted that. He looked at her, really looked at her, his eyes clearing. He saw not the woman from the street, not the signatory on his contract, but Martha, the woman who taught his men to read, the woman who made him smile, the woman who was slowly, painstakingly, bringing his dead house back to life. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. I never expected this, he whispered. I never expected you. I know, she said, her own voice trembling. The contract was forgotten. The ghosts were silent. The storm outside raged, but in the warm glow of the fire, something new was being forged, something real. He leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't like the cold, brief kiss at their wedding. This was a kiss of shared sorrow, of blossoming hope. It was a kiss that rewrote the terms of their deal, transforming it from a business arrangement into something far more precious and far more complicated. The next morning, the storm had passed. The world was covered in a pristine blanket of white snow. The air was clean and cold and new. Everything felt different. Martha woke up not in the guest room, but in the master bedroom, in Samuel's arms. It felt right. For the first time, the house felt like a home. Over breakfast, a comfortable silence settled between them, the silence of a real husband and wife. "I've been thinking," Martha said, breaking the quiet, "about the garden. Sarah's garden. It's been neglected for so long. I'd like to restore it. Come spring." Samuel's smile was full of a light she'd never seen before. I think she would have liked that. Hope, bright and beautiful, was blooming in the winter of their lives. And then, a week later, Martha realized her monthly courses were late. With a trembling heart, she realized the contract she thought had been voided by love was about to be fulfilled after all. She was pregnant. She was going to have his child, his heir. She walked out to the corral to tell him, her heart soaring. This baby wouldn't be a product of a cold bargain. It would be a child of love, a new beginning for both of them. She saw him by the fence staring out at the horizon, but he wasn't looking at his cattle. He was looking at three riders, making their way slowly, deliberately toward the ranch. As they drew closer, Martha could see the man in the lead. He sat a horse with the same easy confidence as Samuel. He had the same dark hair, the same strong jaw, but his eyes were different. They were cold, calculating, and full of a darkness that made her blood run cold. Samuel turned to her, and the look on his face was one of pure shock and a deep, gut-wrenching dread. "Dear God," he breathed. The lead rider dismounted, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Hello, brother," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "Surprised to see me?" It was Jake Hartwell, the brother who was supposed to be dead, and he hadn't come back for a family reunion. He had come back to collect. Jake's return shattered the fragile peace of the Hartwell ranch. He wasn't a ghost from the past. He was a vulture, circling, ready to pick the bones of the life Samuel had built. He didn't come alone. With him was a weaselly lawyer named Ketchum and a hired gun whose hand never strayed far from his pistol. This wasn't a visit. It was an invasion. They sat in Samuel's study, the room where he and Martha had begun to build their future. Now it felt like a war room. "It's simple, brother," Jake said, leaning back in Samuel's leather chair as if he owned it. He tossed a thick portfolio of papers onto the desk. "According to the original homestead claims, we are partners, joint owners. I was presumed dead, but since I've returned within the 10-year legal limit, my half of this enterprise reverts to me." Samuel's face was ashen. "You let me believe you were dead for 7 years." "Business is business," Jake said with a shrug. "And business has been good, from the looks of it. You've done a fine job managing my investment." His gaze slid to Martha, who was standing by Samuel's side, her hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach. His eyes lingered, insolent and appraising. "And you've acquired a new asset, I see. A pretty one, too." "That is my wife," Samuel growled, his hand clenching into a fist. "For now," Jake murmured, a sinister smile playing on his lips. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But here's a funny thing about territorial law, brother. A marriage contract is only as valid as the assets declared within it. Did you tell your little bride here that you only owned half the security you were offering her? A judge might find that to be fraud." The threat was clear. He wasn't just after the ranch. He was after everything. He wanted to destroy Samuel, and he was going to use Martha and their unborn child to do it. "What do you want, Jake?" Samuel asked, his voice tight with rage. "What's rightfully mine? Half of it all. The land, the cattle, the bank accounts." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Or you can buy me out. Let's say a cash payment of $20,000, and I disappear again. Your choice." $20,000. It was an impossible sum, a king's ransom. Jake knew it. He wasn't negotiating. He was issuing an execution order. The days that followed were a living nightmare. Jake and his men took rooms at the hotel in town and began a systematic campaign of terror. Word of the ownership dispute spread like poison through Cedar Ridge. The whispers started again, this time laced with doubt. Samuel's credit at the general store was questioned. The banker, Mr. Thornton, suddenly became very concerned about the ranch's outstanding loans. Then Jake played his cruelest card. He sought out Martha when she was in town alone. He cornered her near the mercantile, his presence intimidating, predatory. "You know," he said, his voice a low, venomous drawl, "I got a letter from Sarah right before she died." Martha froze. "It's true," he insisted, seeing the shock on her face. "She was so unhappy, you know. Samuel, with his moods, his obsession with having a son. She told me she wanted to leave him. She was going to come with me to California. It was a lie. It had to be a lie. But it was a masterful one, designed to crawl inside Martha's head and plant a seed of doubt. A seed that would poison everything. She knew he was a cold man," Jake continued, pressing his advantage. "A man who would buy a wife like a broodmare. She would have hated what he's done to you. You and I, we have a common enemy, Martha. Maybe we should be partners." He was trying to turn her against Samuel, to isolate her, to break them from the inside out. Martha looked him dead in the eye, her fear giving way to a cold, hard fury. "You are a liar," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "And you are a coward. Samuel is 10 times the man you will ever be." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing there. But his laughter followed her down the street. The seed had been planted. That night she couldn't sleep. The lie, as poisonous as it was, had done its work. It made her question things. Did she truly know the man she had married? The man whose child she was carrying? She got out of bed and went to Samuel's study. She didn't know what she was looking for. She just needed something, some proof that Jake was lying. Her eyes fell upon a heavy leather-bound book on a bottom shelf, the Hartwell family Bible. She opened it. Inside, pressed between the pages, were generations of records. Births, deaths, marriages, and something else. Tucked into the back was a thin, hidden ledger. It wasn't Samuel's handwriting. It was a delicate, feminine script. It was Sarah's. It was a private journal, a record of her thoughts, her fears, her hopes. Martha's hands trembled as she read. She read about Sarah's deep love for Samuel. She read about her desperate, all-consuming desire for a child. And she read about her fear of Jake. "Jake has written again," one entry read. "He demands more money. He threatens to tell Samuel about his debts in Topeka, debts I paid to protect the family name before we were married. Samuel must never know. The shame would break him. But Jake is like a wolf. Once he tastes blood, he will not stop." Another entry, dated just a week before she died. "I told Jake there is no more money. He became enraged. He said he would ruin us. He said he would find a way to take the ranch, to take everything Samuel holds dear. I am so afraid. I cannot tell Samuel. The stress, the baby." It was all there. The truth. Jake wasn't just a gambler. He was a blackmailer, an extortionist. He had been tormenting Sarah for years. The argument they'd had on the night she died. It wasn't about Samuel being too hard on his brother. It was about Sarah trying to protect her husband from a monster. And the missing money from Samuel's ledgers? It wasn't a mystery at all. Sarah had been paying Jake off, skimming from the household accounts to feed the wolf at the door. Martha closed the journal, her heart pounding with a fierce, righteous anger. She had it. The proof. The weapon that would destroy Jake Hartwell. But as she stood there in the silent study, a floorboard creaked in the hallway. She wasn't alone. She looked up and saw a shadow in the doorway. It was Maria. The housekeeper's face was a mask of terror. "You should not have found that," Maria whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Some things, they are meant to stay buried." Before Martha could ask what she meant, they heard a shout from outside. Then another. And then the sharp, unmistakable crack of a rifle shot splitting the night air. The war had just turned deadly. The rifle shot was followed by chaos. Men yelling, horses screaming. Samuel burst into the house, his face grim, a rifle in his hand. "It's Jake's men," he said, his voice tight. "They're running off the south herd. It's a distraction." "A distraction for what?" Martha asked, her mind racing. But Samuel was already looking past her, his eyes locking on the journal in her hand. He knew instantly what it was. "Where did you find that?" he demanded, his voice dangerously low. "In the family Bible," she said, holding it out to him. "Samuel, you need to read this." It changes everything. Before he could take it, Tom Fletcher appeared at the door, his face bleeding from a fresh cut. "Boss, they're not just taking the cattle. They've set fire to the north barn." The barn, the one where they stored the winter feed. It was the lifeblood of the ranch. Without it, the herd wouldn't survive the winter. Samuel was torn. His eyes darted from the journal to Martha to his foreman. Jake was brilliant in a cruel, destructive way. He had created a two-front war. "Get every man you can," Samuel ordered Tom. "Try to save the herd. I'll deal with the fire." He turned to Martha, his face a mask of desperation and fury. "Take that book and lock yourself in the cellar. Do not come out, no matter what you hear. Do you understand me?" Martha clutched the journal to her chest. "Samuel, no. You can't go alone." "There's no time," he yelled, grabbing a heavy coat. "Jake wants to draw me out. He wants me away from the house." It was a trap. They both knew it. "Then he's not with his men," Martha realized, her blood running cold. "He's coming here." As if on cue, they heard the sound of a horse riding into the yard. A single horse, moving at a slow, deliberate walk. Samuel looked at Martha, his eyes filled with a terrible certainty. "Go! Now!" He shoved her toward the cellar door, just as the front door of the house splintered open. Jake stood there, silhouetted against the hellish orange glow of the burning barn. He held a pistol in his hand, and he was smiling. "Leaving so soon, brother?" he sneered. "The party's just getting started." Samuel pushed Martha behind him, shielding her with his body. "This is between you and me, Jake. Leave her out of it." "Oh, I don't think so," Jake said, his eyes flicking to the journal Martha was still clutching. "She seems to be right in the middle of it. You always did have a weakness for women with secrets. First Sarah, now her. What's in the book, Martha? What little mystery did my dear sister-in-law leave behind?" He took a step into the room. The fire outside cast flickering, demonic shadows on his face. "It's over, Jake," Samuel said, his own rifle held steady. "I know what you did. I know you tormented Sarah. I know you blackmailed her." Jake just laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You know nothing. Sarah was weak. She was a fool who thought she could control me, just like you. You build this whole world on a foundation of honor and hard work. But you're a fool, Samuel. All it takes is one stick of dynamite to bring the whole thing crashing down." He gestured with his pistol. "Give me the book." "No," Martha said, her voice shaking but defiant. Jake's smile vanished. His eyes turned to chips of ice. "Wrong answer." He fired, but he wasn't aiming for Martha. He fired at the oil lamp on the table beside her. It exploded, showering the room in burning oil and glass. The dry wood of the old house went up like a tinderbox. Flames shot up the curtains, licking at the ceiling. Smoke filled the room, thick and choking. "The book, Samuel!" Jake screamed over the roar of the fire. "Or you all burn together." Samuel was trapped. The fire was spreading, cutting off their escape. Jake stood in the only doorway out, and outside the ranch was being destroyed. It was the end. Jake had won. He had brought the dynamite. But he had underestimated Martha. In the chaos as smoke and flame consumed the room, she saw her chance. Jake was focused on Samuel, on the journal. He wasn't looking at the hearth, where a heavy iron poker lay waiting. She moved faster than she'd ever moved in her life. She grabbed the poker, its weight solid and deadly in her hand. "Jake!" she screamed. He turned, surprised. And in that split second, she swung. She put all her fear, all her rage, all her fierce, protective love for her husband and her unborn child into that one desperate blow. The poker connected with the side of Jake's head with a sickening crack. He staggered, his eyes wide with disbelief. The pistol fell from his hand. He took one step back, then another, and then collapsed to the floor. Silence, except for the roar of the fire. Samuel stared, stunned. He looked from his brother's unconscious form on the floor to his wife, standing there, breathing heavily, the iron poker still clutched in her hand. She was no longer the destitute woman he'd found in the street. She was a warrior, a lioness. But they had no time. The ceiling above them groaned, ready to collapse. "The back window!" Samuel yelled, grabbing her hand. He snatched Sarah's journal from the floor where she'd dropped it. He kicked open the window and bundled her through it, into the cold night air. He followed just as the roof of the study came crashing down in a shower of sparks and flame. They stumbled out onto the lawn, gasping for air, and watched as their home burned. The house that had been a museum of grief, the house where they had found love, was being consumed by the fire Jake had started. The ranch hands, having beaten back the rustlers, were returning. They formed a bucket brigade, but it was hopeless. The house was lost. They stood there huddled together, covered in soot, with nothing left but the clothes on their backs and the smoking ruins of their life. It looked like defeat. It felt like defeat. But as Martha leaned against Samuel, his arm holding her tight, she clutched Sarah's journal. The house was gone. The money was gone. But the truth had survived, and she knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the real fight. Jake had tried to burn the evidence, but he had failed. Now the battle would move from the ranch to the courtroom, and she would be damned if she let him win. The trial was the biggest spectacle Cedar Ridge had ever seen. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension and the smell of sweat and dust. It was Jake Hartwell versus Samuel Hartwell, brother against brother, for the soul of the ranch. Jake, his head bandaged from where Martha had hit him, played the part of the victim perfectly. His lawyer, Ketchum, painted a picture of a man wrongly presumed dead, returning home only to be cast out by his greedy older brother and his conniving, fortune-hunting wife. They presented the documents. The joint homestead claim, the partnership agreement. It looked damning. On paper, Jake had a legitimate claim. The town, which had been on Samuel's side, began to waver. Then Samuel's lawyer, a sharp-eyed man from the territorial capital named Hayes, began his counterattack. He called witness after witness who testified to Samuel's hard work, his honesty, his 7 years of building the ranch alone. Tom Fletcher, Dr. Patterson, even Mrs. Thornton, the banker's wife, who, having been won over by Martha, spoke of her as a woman of great character and a worthy mistress of the Hartwell Ranch. But it was a battle of paper against words, and the paper was strong. The turning point came when Hayes called his final witness. The defense calls Martha Hartwell to the stand. A hush fell over the courtroom. Martha, her pregnancy now obvious to all, walked to the witness stand. She looked small and vulnerable, but her eyes were steady. Hayes was gentle. He had her tell her story, how she met Samuel, the nature of their arrangement, the practical, desperate bargain that had blossomed into something more. She was honest, brutally honest. "So you admit you married him for his money?" Ketchum sneered on cross-examination. "I married him for survival," Martha corrected, her voice ringing with clarity, "just as he married me for an heir. We were two lonely people making a deal. But what you cannot understand, Mr. Ketchum, is that our deal became a marriage. Our house became a home. And the child I am carrying is not a clause in a contract. He is the son of the man I love." The words, spoken with such simple, heartfelt honesty, shifted the mood in the room. But Ketchum wasn't done. He moved in for the kill. "Mrs. Hartwell, isn't it true that on the night of the fire, you assaulted my client with a deadly weapon? That you tried to murder him?" "I defended my husband and my home from a man who was trying to burn us alive," Martha shot back, her voice rising. "So you admit the assault?" Ketchum crowed, turning to the judge. "I admit to stopping a monster from murdering my family," she said. The courtroom was in an uproar. Judge Morrison slammed his gavel, calling for order. "Do you have any proof of these outrageous accusations?" Ketchum demanded. "Any proof that my client, the victim in all this, is the monster you claim he is?" Hayes stood up. "As a matter of fact, we do." He held up a thin, leather-bound book. The cover was scorched, the edges blackened by the fire. Sarah's journal. "This is the private journal of the late Sarah Hartwell," Hayes announced. "It was salvaged from the fire, and it tells a very different story." He read from the journal. He read Sarah's words, her fear of Jake, the story of his blackmail, his threats. He painted a picture of a relentless predator who had tormented his brother's wife for years, driving her to skim money to pay him off, causing the stress that likely contributed to her death. The courtroom was utterly silent. Jake's face had gone pale. He looked trapped, ruined. But then Ketchum stood up, a smug look on his face. "Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay. The diary of a dead woman who cannot be cross-examined. It is inadmissible." Judge Morrison looked at the journal and then at the lawyers. He was a man of the law, and Ketchum was right. The journal was powerful, but legally it was worthless. "The objection is sustained," the judge said, his voice heavy with regret. "The jury will disregard the contents of the journal." A collective gasp went through the room. It was a devastating blow. Their best weapon had just been taken from them. Jake smirked at Samuel across the courtroom. He was going to win. After everything, he was going to win. Martha's heart sank. She looked at Samuel, saw the despair in his eyes. They were going to lose everything. But then, a voice, frail but clear, cut through the silence. "The journal is not the only proof." Every head turned. Standing in the back of the courtroom was Maria, the housekeeper. Her hands were twisting in her apron, her face etched with fear, but her eyes were resolved. "I will testify," she said. Maria walked to the stand, her steps slow but steady. She had been invisible for years, the quiet housekeeper in the background. Now everyone was listening to her. "I was with Senora Sarah," she began, her voice gaining strength. "The night she died, I was there for the whole thing." She looked directly at Jake, her eyes burning with a righteous fire that had been banked for 7 long years. "Senor Jake, he was there that night. He was not in California. He was here." The courtroom exploded. "He came to the house while Senor Samuel was at the barn," Maria continued, her voice rising over the noise. "He demanded money from Senora Sarah. She told him there was no more. They argued. He got angry. He grabbed her. He shook her." Maria's voice broke. Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. "She fell. She hit her stomach on the corner of the table. Hard. The labor started right then. It was too soon. It was violent. It was because of him. It wasn't just blackmail. It wasn't just threats. Jake hadn't just caused the argument that had tormented Samuel for 7 years. He had caused Sarah's death. He had killed his brother's wife and his unborn child. The secret Maria had been commanded to keep, the secret she believed should stay buried, was finally out. Jake stood up, his face a mask of pure, murderous rage. "She's lying. The old woman is crazy." But no one was listening to him. They were all looking at him, seeing him for the monster he was. Samuel rose from his chair, his face unreadable. He walked slowly, deliberately, across the courtroom floor until he stood directly in front of his brother. He didn't yell. He didn't scream. He just spoke, his voice a low, deadly whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. "You took everything from me once," he said. "You will not do it again." Then he turned his back on Jake and walked to his wife. He took her hand, pulling her to her feet. They stood together, united as Judge Morrison delivered his verdict. The ranch belonged to Samuel. The claims were dismissed. The case was closed. Justice had been served. As the townspeople erupted in cheers, Martha looked at her husband. The ghosts had finally been exorcised. The secrets had been brought into the light. They had lost their home, but they had found something far more important. They had found the truth, and they had found it together. They walked out of the courthouse into the bright sunlight, leaving the wreckage of the past behind them. Their future was uncertain. They would have to rebuild from nothing, but they would do it together, a man, a woman, and their unborn child. A family forged not by a contract, but by fire and by faith. And what happened to Jake? Well, a man who causes the death of a beloved woman and her child doesn't last long on the frontier, even if the law can't touch him. But that's a story for another time. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, and you believe that the strongest foundations are the ones we build ourselves, do me a favor. Hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed, because the stories we have coming are ones you won't want to miss. Thanks for watching.